Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Jenkins. So here we are for our first big chapter, and it's a good one, all right? So we're going to first be giving an introduction to each nutrient, structure and function, and then we're going to talk about nutritional guidelines. So what you're going to see, as I talked about already, whatever I circle or mark with red, whatever I point out is what's most important. This will allow you to focus on what's most important. A lot of times I'll include some information, but it'll just be, here's some extra information, but you don't need to know it. And when I say that, I mean it, okay? So you only need to be studying the things I ask you to know. So here's our outline. I want to jump right in. I'm going to break this down into 2 videos just to make it a little bit easier to digest, but the beauty of the videos is that you can start and stop, you can replay. Okay, so here we go. Folks, here are some basics. You absolutely have to know it. So we have 6 total nutrients, and they're broken down into macro and micro. This is not about size of the nutrient. Rather, it's macro or micro based on how much we need in our diet. Did you hear that? Not about size of the particle. Instead, a macronutrient is one that we need more of. In other words, in our daily diet, we need more carbs, fat, protein, and water. Our micronutrients are not necessarily smaller in size. Instead, when we say micronutrients, what we mean is they're needed in lower amounts. Now, it's not that any one is more important than the other. They're all very important. They're all very important. It's just that based on how our body is made, we tend to need more of certain nutrients than others, but they're all important. So macronutrients we need more of in our diet: carbs, fat, protein, water. Those are the biggies. Micronutrients we need less of. Those are the vitamins and minerals. When you get these exam and quiz questions, this should be an easy one. Got it? Okay. All right. I'm not sure how you feel about nutrition, but you might be thinking, oh, it's going to be so boring, whatever. But it's not. We need food because it's mostly going to act as fuel, right? And I hope you can come around to viewing it this way. I mean, a lot of food tastes good, yeah. But if we view it as fuel, to properly fuel our finely tuned body organs. Okay. If you don't fuel it well, if you don't fuel a car well, look what happens. That's an old Honda Civic. Check it out. First generation, probably 1978. If you don't fuel properly, just like a car, it will not end well. Now, the thing about our body is really good at compensating and covering up things. We can get away with treating our bodies like crap. And let's face it, a lot of us do, even from time to time. We all have our moments. But in the end, if we stress our body and don't properly fuel it, it will not end well. Okay, so the first part of this chapter is going through the nutrients, both macro and micro, give basic structure and function. We're going to keep this simple because later on, we're going to have a whole chapter just on carbohydrates, a whole chapter just on fats, just on proteins, etc. So this is the introduction. Basic. Okay, so our first macronutrient are carbohydrates. We're going to talk about the structure first. There are simple sugars, and then there are complex sugars. A simple sugar is smaller. A monosaccharide is a nutrient that is one sugar. Mono means one, saccharide means sugar, like glucose. This is a one sugar, glucose. A disaccharide, as the prefix suggests, is a 2 sugar. Whereas a poly means many, 3 or more sugars put together. So we have simple carbohydrates or sugars, and by the way, carbohydrates and sugars are basically the same thing, When you say sugar, you're saying carbohydrate, vice versa. Structurally, there are simple sugars, a mono and a disaccharide, 1 or 2 sugars, and a complex sugar is a polysaccharide, 3 or more sugars put together. It might be a 10 sugar chain or it might be a 100 sugar chain. So here are some examples. A monosaccharide is 1 sugar. Please know an example, glucose. We're going to be talking a lot about glucose. Glucose is the simple sugar. It's the monosaccharide that circulates in our bloodstream. Primary fuel for our cells. One example of a disaccharide, which is 2 sugars. One example of a disaccharide is sucrose. You see I put things in red? Sucrose is what we know as table sugar. When you add half a cup of sugar to a recipe, table sugar. When you sprinkle a little bit of sugar over toast with cinnamon, have you ever done that? You make some toast, put a little butter on it after it's warm, a little cinnamon, a little sugar, cinnamon sugar toast, very good. Table sugar is a disaccharide. And then polysaccharide. The 2 that I want to talk about, starch and glycogen. So remember, a polysaccharide is 3 or more sugars put together. Starch, we know about starch. Starch is like a polysaccharide that's in potatoes, starchy foods, potatoes, rice, bread. Glycogen is stored glucose. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about this, but we're just laying the foundation. I know some of these terms, they sound kind of familiar. Glucose, glycogen. Folks, you can do it. Glucose is the monosaccharide, 1 sugar, that circulates in our bloodstream. Glucose. Our body has the ability to store glucose because we don't want all of our glucose in the bloodstream at once. That would be too much. So your body has the ability to take some of that glucose and store it for later. We store glucose in our skeletal muscles. We store glucose in our liver. But the stored form of glucose is glycogen. We take those individual monosaccharides, glucose, and we combine them into a storage form that forms a polysaccharide, glycogen. You've seen these before, glucose. If you've ever been familiar with a gel packet, that's going to contain the simplest form of sugar we can think of, glucose. Sucrose, I already mentioned, table sugar. Glycogen, stored form of glucose, I already showed you that. Fiber, do I have, let's see, I'm sorry to go back and forth. So let me do this. Sometimes I'll go back just because I want to make things clear. Let's group these together, starch and fiber. Just think of potatoes. Any kind of potatoes you like. Maybe you cut them into wedges and bake them in the oven at a high temperature so they're healthier potato wedges / french fries. Maybe you want delicious mashed potatoes. Those are starchy and they're full of fiber. Okay. So you've seen these before, folks. Let me see. Okay. We're going to be talking about a lot of this. This is one of my favorite cartoons, by the way. Definitely I don't like to be weighed in public, so I imagine is it a grapefruit or an orange? Doesn't like to either. We're going to be talking about this more later, but I just want to lay the foundation. So here we are talking about our first macronutrient, carbohydrates. We talked about the structure of carbohydrates. There are simple carbohydrates, a monosaccharide, 1 sugar like glucose, a disaccharide, 2 sugars like sucrose or table sugar. And then we talked about complex sugars, which are the polysaccharides, 3 or more sugars together. Our examples of polysaccharides are starch and fiber, what's in potatoes, and glycogen, stored glucose. Let's just introduce a recommended amount in your daily diet. So we're going to talk about this more later, but the recommended daily intake. In other words, each day, somewhere between 45 and 65% of your calories should come from carbohydrates. You need to imprint that percentage into your brain. Each day, somewhere between 45 and 65% of our diet should come from carbs. 45 to 65% carbs. What is the function? Energy. The primary function of carbohydrates, energy, 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 energy. It's a fuel source to every cell. Not just muscle cells, but every cell. It doesn't matter what kind of cell it is, folks. Even a skin cell is there for protection. Cells are living, functioning things that need energy to be able to do their jobs. What is a primary fuel source for our cells? Carbohydrates. I want to be more specific. So if we're more specific, it is our immediate energy source. It is what our cells go to first. It's what our cells, so yes, it's energy, but you're going to have to be more specific. It's what our cells go to first. We're going to talk later about some other functions, and a thing that might be interesting to you, the central nervous system is only able to burn carbohydrates for energy. We're going to see in a moment, another big energy source for our cells is fat. We love to burn fat. But did you know our central nervous system can only burn carbohydrates? So, carbohydrates are important, very important. I know lately, the last 15 years, people are more carbohydrate phobic. Oh, I don't want to have too many carbs. Especially for athletes, we need energy. You can imagine if we have a low carb diet, we could potentially be putting our central nervous system at risk. And let's be honest, we kind of need our brain. Yeah, it's kind of important. Everything else here is extra. You need to know when I'm pointing out in red or circling or saying you need to know. Everything else is extra. Okay, I just stopped for a drink there, some water. Our second macronutrient is lipids. So remember, we're talking about macronutrients, what we need more of in our diet. Our first macronutrient, carbohydrates, we just talked about that. Our second macronutrient, lipids. Lipids is a fancy word for fats, but as we're going to see, there's different types. It's not just that yummy Big Mac fat. Not that you would eat that, of course. We're going to talk about the structure. We're going to have a whole chapter on lipids later. Aren't you excited? You don't need to know any of this now. I did want to include a picture because it does look different than the carbohydrates, but you don't need to know that for now. Don't need to know that for now. I think when I transferred this over, some of the things on the bottom didn't come over. That's okay, I'll fill it in. We're going to break this down into 3 types of lipids. One lipid would be a triglyceride. We're not going to use simple or compound. One type of lipid, and actually the type of lipid that you think of, is a triglyceride. This is the dietary fat. This is the Big Mac, the French fries, the Oreos. There's also healthy fats, omega-3s, healthy fat in things like avocado, salmon, okay? So one type of lipid would be the triglycerides or dietary fats in food. A second type of lipid that you may not have heard of is a phospholipid. A phospholipid is something that makes up our cell membrane. We're going to talk more about this later. But it's not just the fat that we get from foods that we use for energy, like the triglycerides. There's other types of lipids in our body, like phospholipids. They make up the cell membrane. Our third example would be the derived lipids, and it got cut off here, but we're going to call these steroids. Let me just skip ahead for one moment. Yeah, cholesterol. Okay. We're going to talk later about the function of steroids, so you don't really need to know those now. What we're going to talk about later, the steroid category includes things like sex hormones. We need fat, a certain type of fat, to make testosterone and estrogen. That's interesting. We need a certain type of fat, a steroid type of fat, to produce cholesterol. I know cholesterol gets a bad rap, but it does have some positive functions in our body when it's not in excess. Cholesterol is actually a transporter, helps us transport other types of fats. But for now, we're just going to talk about the two. For now, lipids. The triglycerides are the dietary fats that you get from food. And there's another category of lipids called phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. Hopefully you're filling out your outline, taking good notes so we can keep it simple, okay? 2 types of lipids to know right now. Triglycerides, the dietary fats in food. Phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. Functions. Those triglycerides, energy. But just like the carbohydrates, we're going to be a little bit more specific. Whereas the carbohydrates were the energy source that our cells go to first. Fats are what our cells go to later. Long-term energy. So look, our body turns to carbs first and then fat. Now, what we're going to see is ultimately most of our cells tend to be burning a carbohydrate-fat mixture. We ultimately tend to be burning a little bit of both. In the short term, we're burning much more carbohydrates, immediate, shorter term. In the longer term, the longer our cells are in need of energy, the more fat we're going to burn. And I already talked about phospholipids. They make up the cell membrane. Don't worry about cholesterol for now. Good. Just like we did for carbohydrates, we're going to give a range that's recommended for fats. This would be the triglycerides, 20 to 35%. So what were the dietary recommendations per day for carbohydrates? Per day, for carbohydrates, somewhere between 45 and 65% of our diet should come from carbs. What about fat? It might be more than you think. I don't know. Fat, 20 to 35% of our daily calories should come from triglycerides. Get these numbers in. This is a memorization, folks. Memorization. You can memorize song lyrics. You can memorize other things in your life, plays on the football field. You just have to sit down and do it in a quiet place over and over and over again. Carbohydrates, 45 to 65. Carbohydrates, 45 to 65. Fats, 20 to 35. Fats, 20 to 35. And let me tell you, when I was a student, I really had to work a lot. I didn't have a photographic memory. I really had to study a lot. And I'm not joking when I say I might go through something as I'm studying 100 times. I'm serious. I may be walking through the grocery store. Wait a minute. Carbohydrates, what's the daily need? 45 to 65%. Carbohydrates, 45 to 65. Fat, 20 to 35. Like just over and over and over again, okay? You don't need to know cholesterol for now. All right. And last of the big 3, carbohydrates, fat, protein. Here's our protein introduction. What makes protein different from other macronutrients, carbohydrates and fat in particular? We just talked about 2 macronutrients that we need larger amounts, carbohydrate, fat, protein. Protein, even though you don't need to know the specific structure, protein contains nitrogen. It doesn't even matter that we understand the chemical structure, but if I look at this amino acid in the bottom right, there's an N. That N signifies proteins contain nitrogen. If I go back, there is not nitrogen in lipids. What do I see? H, O, hydrogen, oxygen, C, carbon, hydrogen. Look at the top here, oxygen, carbon. Oh, sorry, did I say it? I didn't mean nitrogen if I just said it. If we look at these 2 pictures, there's no N. no nitrogen. If we go back to carbohydrates, you don't need to know the structure. I just put it on here. Is there an N for nitrogen? Nope. H, O. That's it. So structurally, and I'm sorry if I'm giving you whiplash by moving too quickly. Feel free to look away. What makes protein unique is that it contains nitrogen. Okay. Structurally, proteins are made up of amino acids. This you very well may have heard of. Just like carbohydrates are made up of monosaccharides or disaccharides or polysaccharides for carbohydrates, a protein is made up of amino acids. They're the building blocks. Every protein in your body is made up of some combination of amino acids. There are 20 total amino acids. This means that every amino acid in our body that we eat through food, every amino acid is some combination of these 20, period. Now, structure can look really different. You don't need to know this. I'm just showing you some pictures. Sometimes we have a protein that is just a long chain of amino acids. This is insulin, by the way. A hormone, helps to regulate blood sugar. Sometimes we take those amino acids and we ball them up into these conglomerate thingies. That's hemoglobin, a protein that transports oxygen on our red blood cell surface. We know that there are proteins in muscle. The proteins in muscle tend to be these small little bands. So those amino acids can take all sorts of shapes. You don't need to know this for now. I'm just saying. Okay. Of the 20, didn't we say that there are 20 total amino acids? And when I write AA, I mean amino acids, not Alcoholics Anonymous. There are, of the 20, some amino acids that are considered essential and some that are considered non-essential. Essential means that it cannot be made from our body, and therefore we must get it through food. It's a little bit weird how they came up with these names. It's not necessarily intuitive. So whatever way you can think of to remember this, when they say an essential amino acids, what they're saying is it's essential to get it through food. We must get it through food. Here are the 9 essential amino acids. You don't need to know them. I would be crazy to ask you to memorize histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, valine. Oh my God, that makes me want to shove a pencil in my eye. You don't need to know the specifics. Just that there are 20 total amino acids. Of the 29, and please know this number, 9 are considered essential because it is essential that we get it through diet. The other 11 are considered non-essential. We don't need to get them through diet. Of course we do sometimes, but we don't need to. Why? They can be produced by the body. Did you know? Our body can make over half of our amino acids. I don't know why this arrow got messed up. This is supposed to be pointing to these. I've listed them. You don't need to know them. That's kind of cool, right? Our cells make protein for us. I bet that you may not have known. Our cells make protein for us. Over half, 11 of the 20 amino acids our cells can make for us. Those are called the non-essential amino acids. Folks, try and simplify. You can absolutely do this, right? Take this information in. Take notes in small pieces. Then study in small pieces. Let's just look at protein. What have we said so far for protein? Protein is a macronutrient. It means that we need to get a lot of it through our diet. Macronutrient protein. Protein is structurally made up of amino acids. Protein structurally contains nitrogen. Of the 20 amino acids that can make up a protein, of the 20 amino acids, some are considered essential, some are non-essential. 9 of the 20 are considered essential amino acids. because we must get them through diet. They're essential to get through diet, 9 of the 20 amino acids. The remaining 11 amino acids are considered non-essential. We don't need to get them through the diet because our body can make them. Now here's the point. Because our body can make a lot of the amino acids we need, we don't need to ingest as much through diet as you might think. A lot of times when I teach this class in person, I will ask the class, I'll pose a question. Of the big 3, carbs, fat, and protein, I'll ask the students, what do you think we need to eat the most of? Carbs, fat, or protein? What do we need to eat the most of? And a lot of people will say protein. And you can't blame them because protein has gotten to be quite trendy over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Protein this, protein that, high in protein food, you need protein. Well, we do need protein, but it turns out we don't need as much of it as some of the others. Why? Because our body makes a lot of these amino acids for you. We're going to talk a whole lot more about this later. I'm not a protein phobic person. I'm an athlete. I did the Ironman 4 times. I run 6 marathons. I get it. We need protein. But this is a scientific fact that our body makes protein for us. Therefore, we don't need as much through diet as you might think. Does our body make carbohydrates in the same way? No. Does our body make fats in the same way? No. We're pretty much reliant to get all of our carbs through food, all of our fat through food, but not quite protein. So yes, it's really important. I'm not saying protein is less important. I'm just saying we don't need to eat as much as you think. Why? Because our body makes a lot for us. We're going to talk about this more later. If you bring in too much protein, your body can't store it. It's hard to break down. Guess what? If you bring in more protein than your body can handle, your body has no choice but to turn that protein into fat. And I'm guessing that's not what you wanted. All right, so you do you. I know some people, they don't want to believe me. I'm just giving you the facts. Okay, you don't need to know this. We can qualify a protein as complete or incomplete based off of whether or not it has all the essential amino acids. You don't need to know this. Here's what I do want you to know. What is the percentage that we need each day? 10 to 35%. What was carbohydrate? Again, you need to get these tattooed in your memory. Somewhere between 45 and 65% of our calories each day should come from carbs. What was the amount for fat? 20 to 35%. And then here we have protein. Somewhere between 10 and 35%. Now, it's a range because it depends where you are. If you're an athlete, you might need more protein. If you're a diabetic, you might need less carbohydrates. So we give a range. More on that later. But you can see overall what we need the most of, carbohydrates. Okay. We're going to talk later about this. Another way of talking about protein intake is grams of protein per kilo of body weight. But we'll talk about that later. What I want to do is I want to talk about functions of protein. And I really should update this, and it's my apologies, but let me just give you a simpler way of thinking about this. One function of our body is structure. One function of protein in our body is structure, whether it's muscles, hair, nails, skin, tendons, ligaments, okay? A second function of protein, it forms chemicals in our body. I know it's not in red, but I want you to know it. One big function of protein in the body, it gives us structure. Muscles, skin, okay? Structure. Number two function is forms chemicals. A lot of your really important chemicals are actually protein. Hormones, enzymes, neurotransmitters, hemoglobin, antibodies that help our immune system fight disease. The list goes on and on. That's one that we don't think of, but it's really important. We need protein to help form these really important chemicals. And our third and final function Protein can be used for energy, but it's our last resort. We want to use mostly carbs and fat as energy for the cells. Usually, we only want to use about 10 to 15% of our energy from protein, which means 85 to 90% of our cells' energy comes from carbs and fat. All right. Trying to simplify it as best we can. Our last macronutrient is water. So again, our macronutrients, what we need more of in our diet: carbs, fat, protein, and now we're on water. We have a lot of water. You don't need to know the percentages. Just know we have a lot of it. Exclamation point. I've underlined some functions I'd like you to know. Protection. There's a layer of water around our brain to help cushion it. There's a thin film of water around our heart to reduce friction. Water acts as a universal solvent. Things dissolve in it, in the bloodstream especially. Water plays a role in chemical reactions. These are the three that I've picked, okay? Of course, it has more. We have a whole chapter on this later. All right. Lastly, let's quickly address the micronutrients. So what were the macronutrients? Carbs, fat, protein, water. We need more of them. The micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. We need less of them in the diet, but they're still really important. It's not that they're less important. We just don't need as much of them through diet for them to carry out their functions. I think of these micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals, as a supporting cast. If you go see a play, or if you're on a baseball field or any team, you have the stars, but you can't have anything be good without the supporting cast. What we're going to talk about later, we have whole chapters on this later in this course. We do not use vitamins and minerals for energy, so they do not provide energy. Do not. Right? What do our cells rely on most for energy? Carbs, fat, protein, only as a last resort. But they have other functions that we'll talk about more later. I'm going to save the rest of the discussion for micronutrients until later. All you need to know is that these are micronutrients. We don't need as much of them. So here I've provided a summary table with what you need to know. Alrighty. Okay, I'm going to stop this first part of the video, and then we'll come back and do the second part.